Hello everybody, and welcome to CIHT's webinar on our visibility research project. My name is Andrew Hugill. I'm Director of Policy and Technical Affairs here at CIHT. And thank you to all of you for joining. We've got over 200 people online, and we're aware that visibility and this research is of interest to all of you. So hopefully this webinar will answer some questions about what it is that we're seeking to do. I'd like to welcome now Phil Jones, who is helping us out with this visibility research. So Phil, if you want to turn on your web camera and your microphone. You're with us, Phil, just to say hello.
Hello, hi everybody.
Good, everything working. So, as I say, Phil, CIHT sort of appointed Phil just to help us with a bit of assistance in getting this research project together. And in a few minutes, he's going to go through a recorded presentation that will outline what it is that we're seeking to do. I'm conscious that many of you might have well been on the webinar we ran earlier on the week around manual for streets, and we referred to this webinar on that. We've been very fortunate, I think, that the ability to get a grant from the Department for Transport to do manual for streets has happened at the same time as we were able to apply from a grant under the Road Research Fund or Road Safety Research Fund from the department, because the issue of visibility is very much linked into manual for streets and what we're seeking to do there. So Phil will explain more about that as we move forward. What we're going to do, given the number of people on the call, is invite questions by you writing questions down on the questions tab that you have. Please do that throughout the video that we'll be playing shortly, because it will enable us to start drawing threads together. And then Phil and I will come back after the presentation to answer those questions as well as we can. What I want to do before we go into the video, though, is just have a poll which will ask you just to indicate sort of what your role is. And the reason for that is just so that's helpful to us to understand who's joining, who's interested in this subject. So I'm going to show the poll now. You should be able to click one of the four options. So if you wanted to start doing that now, I'd be grateful. That should be up on screen now. And you're all firing away, so that's great. Transport planners are the lead at the moment. Highways engineers, road safety professionals, and local government officers, all well represented. So that's great. The numbers are increasingly nicely. We've got almost 90% of you voted. So I'm going to close that now and then just share the results with you. So there we go. So highways engineers, just over a quarter, a third of you transport planners, 10% of you roughly about local government officers, and 30% road safety professionals. So thanks very much for that. That's helpful just to understand who is here. So what I'm going to do now is play the video. It lasts about 15 minutes, and as I say, if you could be asking questions via the question box as this is playing, would be really grateful, because that will allow us to think of questions and answers. So Phil and I will turn off our videos now, and I'll play the video.
Good afternoon. In this presentation, I'll run through the background to the research study, the technical issues that it needs to address, the questions that need to be answered, and the process for expressing interest in carrying out the work and being part of a members advisory group. So this research study is into the safety issues and operational questions around visibility splays at major minor priority junctions. It's being funded by a £100,000 grant from the Department for Transport, which is coming from the Road Safety Research Fund. And that fund supports research that delivers evidence to promote casualty reduction, develops new data sets to predict collisions, and where the findings can be applied nationally, and all of those criteria the department has accepted that applies in this case. And on the latter point, the findings of this study will be part of and support the review and update of Manual for Streets, which was discussed at a webinar earlier this week. So, background, I'm sure as many people will appreciate on the call, visibility displays are a fundamental aspect of highway engineering and commonly considered by highway engineers for existing and new junctions. They consist of the X and Y distance, the X distance being the setback from the giveaway line over which it's necessary to have clear visibility, and the Y distance is the distance measured along the major road. And in the UK, that Y distance is generally based on stopping sight distance, the distance that's forecast is required for a vehicle to come to a halt when it's travelling at a certain design speed. And UK engineers generally consider that it's vitally important to minimising collisions and therefore casualties. Now, other countries do use different approaches or in fact place less reliance on visibility displays, and that's an area that we think is worthy of consideration. But the real problem is that we have considerable uncertainty around the standards that we should apply in different contexts, and that's something that does need to be addressed and is very much a focus of this study. So the importance of visibility displays, they are very often critical to the feasibility of new accesses to developments. So there's a strong link between visibility displays and their requirements and the planning system. And I think it's fair to say that they are often a source of considerable debate and even disagreement between highways professionals, perhaps on different sides of the fence when it comes to planning applications. Excessive requirements for visibility, if that is what is being asked for, they could in fact prevent much needed development. But of course, the other side of the coin is the concern is that under providing visibility could create hazardous layouts and lead to more collisions and casualties. So getting them right is really important. So Manual for Streets was published, as many of you will know, back in 2007, and that did bring in reduced stopping sight distances for urban sites, defined as those with a speed limit or a design speed of up to 60 kilometers per hour. And those stopping sight distances were based on shorter driver reaction times, how long it takes for a driver to react in the face of a hazard. And then once they've started to apply the brakes, the deceleration rate that is assumed, and a value of 0.45 G was assumed. And those values are different to those that underpin the SSD values that are given in or were given in Design Bulletin 32 and those that are still in DMRB, even though those parameters were not stated. And TRL did research in report 661 that underpin that. And you can see there that for 37 miles per hour, 60 kph, the Y distance came down from 90 meters in DB32 to 59, and that allowed for bonnet length. More precise numbers because it was based on a calculation. In Manual for Streets 2, the same approach was used for urban streets for cars, but it introduced different parameters for HGVs and buses. There was some concern that the deceleration rate should be slightly different and less onerous. And so you can see that a 0.375 G deceleration rate was used, but the same reaction time was used on the basis that drivers would be behaving similarly whether they were driving an HGV or a light vehicle. Above 60 kph, it said use the parameters that underlie DMRB, and as you can see that's a 2-second reaction time and 0.25 G for a desirable minimum and 0.375 for absolute minimum as DMRB was constituted at that point. Now, rather than a simple lookup table, Money for Streets 2 felt that engineers, technicians could be given a tool to use that would be more perhaps finer to use and allow for measurements of speed particularly for some of these edge cases. So it gave that formula, which you can see, and on the face of it looks quite complicated, but really it's just simple mathematics, simple equations of motion. And it was based on the design speed, the driver perception reaction time that we've talked about, and the deceleration, and also included a factor for longitudinal gradient, because obviously vehicles take longer to stop in a downhill direction. And through CIHT and ourselves, we developed an app that would assist in those calculations, and it's now on PJA's website. What the change at 60 kph though means that you can see from the lines on the graph that it leads to quite a large jump in theoretical visibility requirements at 60 kph. So we get this this difficulty when measured speeds are around that point of suddenly the guidance requires a significant increase in visibility, and that can be very hard to achieve where land is constrained, and it can lead to significant disagreements and delays to decisions on planning. In addition to that work though, research was done by TMS consultancy, road safety consultancy, in the preparation of Money for Streets 2 that looked at the more fundamental question of whether there actually was a demonstrable link between a wide distance visibility and collisions and casualties, and it found that they were unable to demonstrate that reducing that wide distance would be directly associated with increased collision risk. And it produced scatter graphs like that related visibility, measured visibility to collisions. So a few more details on that. It looked at over 1,000 collisions that were, in the opinion of TMS, potentially related to poor visibility at 94 locations. All of those sites were chosen. They had 3 or more of those potential poor visibility collisions that had taken place over 5 years. The sites were visited and visibility was measured to the left and to the right, both to the curb and to 1 metre out from the curb. I'll say a bit more about that. And they usually need a regression to compare those collisions with the measured wide distances, produce the graphs that I've just shown. But there were some limitations on the research. The budget was not the scale that we're now looking at. For example, there was no analysis of traffic flow or actual speeds at those locations. So back to those technical issues, the resulting wording in Manual for Streets 2 based on that research was this. It said, it's often been assumed that a failure to provide visibility at priority junctions in accordance with values recommended will result in increased risk of injury collisions, but research carried out found no evidence of this. And therefore it said, unless there's local evidence to the contrary, reducing visibility below those values will not necessarily lead to a significant problem. But that's been very difficult guidance to apply in practice, and I think understandably road safety professionals find it perhaps a little too woolly to have confidence in going below those recommended values. And as I said, there is another issue of where we should measure visibility splays too. We all know, I think, practicing professionals, that generally wide distance is measured to the near side curb line, and that's what Money for Streets says. Although it says, although vehicles will normally be travelling at a distance from the curb line, obviously vehicles have a width, they're not infinitely narrow, and they're not travelling on the curb line. So you can see in this photograph that the truck can be seen to a greater distance from the curb. If we look at where the measurement might be to the curb line and the distance to the actual near side of the truck, and for a truck obviously you could look to the far side, but if it was a motorcycle then it would be just the point object. It is a greater distance, not a hugely greater distance in some cases, but could be significant in those edge cases. So the research questions that we're looking to answer in the light of all of that. The first question is, what is the relationship between visibility displays, thinking of both X and Y distances, at major minor junctions and collisions and casualties? What is that relationship? And how does that relationship vary with site-specific factors? And we've listed a whole lot there. How far we can get to those factors in the budget and given the methodology is something that we will be looking for views on. But ideally, we would try to shed more light as to how local factors and visibility are related to collisions and casualties. And therefore, what theoretical basis or bases should be used to determine visibility display standards? And should stopping sight distance as part of that question continue to underpin visibility display standards, or should other approaches be used? And if so, in what circumstances? So the indicative methodology that we have put forward to Department for Transport in calling for the research grant would be a literature review of published research on the topic, not confined to the UK, of course, and then a study of statistically robust set of priority junctions, building on the methodology used in the previous TMS research, but adding additional measured parameters, and then the reporting, dissemination and input to the refresh of Manual for Streets. But that methodology is indicative, and it would be the responsibility of the appointed research team, and we are welcoming creative approaches to this question. So in terms of the project timeline, expressions of interest will be invited shortly via the CIHT website with a closing date of the 24th of August. And then once the tenderers have been selected, the brief will be issued around the end of September with a closing date of early November. The selection process would then happen of the successful tenderer with an aim for a project award by the end of November, and then with the project being completed by the end of next year, the end of December 2021. So just to go into a bit more detail of that process of the expression of interest, we're looking for a team with a broad range of skills to cover all of the issues: highway engineering, road safety investigation, statistical analysis, and that academic rigor to have confidence in the findings. And the expressions of interest therefore will need to include the details of the organisation. Organisations could be consortia to cover all of those skills, with CVs of the key team members, statements of the experience of the organisations relevant to the project, a demonstration of the understanding of the research questions and the issues behind them, and importantly, a proposed methodology, how the consortia or organisation will go about the study, including key milestones. We're not looking for a huge amount of information at this stage, perhaps around 25 pages maximum, and no financial information. And just to indicate how the project will be structured, there will be a CIHT project board with senior members of the institution running the project, and possibly with some DFT involvement and appointing the research consultant who would report to the project board. But it's also seen that it would be an important role for a group of members who may be interested in this topic to advise on the conduct of the research and liaise with the project board as the study goes forward. And so one of the things that we would like from today is some indication of whether members would be interested in being involved in such a group. And so we'd now like to take questions. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much, Phil. And if you could start your webcam, well, there you are. Well done. Okay, so thanks for that, Phil. Right, so we've got lots of questions. I don't know if you've been looking at them as they've been coming in, Phil.
Yep.
Where do we want to start? I think we've got around 40 minutes left. So how do we want to play this. There's quite a lot of detail questions in there, I note. Is there anything you want particularly to pick out of those?
I think perhaps just to deal with one of the details, a few people have mentioned the X distance, and obviously in the presentation focus on the Y distance. That's usually something that there is a lot of debate over, but there can also be debate over the X distance. And yes, we would like to include that in the assessment. So when sites are measured, when the original TMS research was done, they did measure visibility, I think, at both 2.4 meters and 4.5 meters back, measured the Y distance, and checked to see whether there was a relationship between collisions and casualties and visibility as measured from those 2 points, and they couldn't find it. Made little difference. So yes, I think we should include that because it is critical. I noticed that DMRB talks about in the latest version of DMRB talks about X distance. It's relaxed the 9 meters to some extent. That's now a should rather than a shall, but still relates X distance to whether the road is a through route, for example. So I think we'd like to see whether we can investigate what the evidence is for that in more urban situations. So yeah.
Okay. Just shall we pick up, Phil, the issue around sort of, there's a number of questions and comments around sort of how manual for streets and DMRB sort of interact with one another. The two sort of projects that we've got are sort of different projects. This is a research project that's seeking to get information that we can feed into manual for streets. So is it worth saying a bit about sort of how DMRB and that interact at the moment?
Yeah, I think DMRB is still referred to extensively by highway engineers for non-trunk situations, and perhaps that's something of a legacy. Manual for Streets was, and Manual for Streets 2 was intended to be the go-to documents for non-trunk situations, but obviously it doesn't carry the level of detail that DMRB does. I think what's just happened is in the time since Manual for Streets and Manual for Streets 2 were written, DMRB has moved yet further towards trunk roads in its rewriting. It's now very codified, very clear. A lot of the guidance has been taken out, and it's actually quite difficult now to apply in non-trunk situations. And I think Sally Gibbons of DFT explained that on the seminar, on the webinar on Wednesday, that the hope and expectation is that the new manual for streets will be more detailed, will be more loose leaf in format, although we're mainly online, but there'll be a ability to expand it and to change it over time, and that will become increasingly the go-to document. So I think the work that's done here is very important. Will pave the way for the assessment of this critical aspect in non-trunk situations generally.
Okay, thanks. There's just picking out a comment on the presentation seemed to focus on driver-to-driver visibility rather than and potentially describing other users such as cyclists. I mean, that just to sort of knock that on the head, Phil, that was one of our key areas for why we submitted to the Road Safety Research Fund, because that's all about vulnerable users. So perhaps just to clarify that we're looking at all highway users here.
Indeed, and sorry, we flashed through it fairly quickly on the presentation, but one of the parameters we'd like to assess when these sites are looked at is what are the cycle flows, what is the provision for cyclists in different situations. What I would say, of course, though, is that cyclists generally are travelling at a slower speed, and therefore stopping sight distances are different. So the parameters that are used relate to generally to the percentile speed of motor traffic. Visibility splays for cyclists are set out or will be set out in the new local transport note on cycling, which I think is due to be published quite soon. But yes, that is an issue that needs to be taken into account in the methodology for certain.
Okay. There's reference, Phil, to several other standards. So, for example, Northern Ireland's DCAM 15 guidance. that's fair to say that in the research project, that's a specific task to look across
Yes.
different ways of doing this.
Very much so. Very much so. I think looking at different practices, not just in the UK, but in other countries, this is obviously a common highway engineering issue that is dealt with in many different places.
Okay, and then a question around sort of the scope of the types of junctions looked at. So there was pulling a couple of together here. That clearly this is about priority junctions. There was a question around signalised junctions, but also from Leanne, will the assessment consider different junction types characteristics as part of the study? I guess the answer to that is yes, Phil. We're looking for a range of
range of different junction types. As I say, there's a question that the balance needs to be struck between the breadth of the study and how many different types of junction we look at, and the depth to which can be investigated. So I think we are looking for what can be done in terms of innovative approaches, in terms of data gathering, how much can be gathered remotely, how much requires site visits, which is perhaps a more expensive way of doing it. So how far we can get with that, I think is something that we are looking to see how best to do that. A question was asked about traffic signals. So this is specifically around priority junctions, because the visibility splay question is, I think, perhaps most acute in that situation. It's the most difficult and most common area of disagreement that I think professionals have to deal with. But yes, clearly, I think someone asked the question, will stopping sight distances recommended, or that come from this, be reflected at traffic signal junctions? And I think the answer probably for me would be yes, but I think that's something that could be looked at as part of the literature review. I think to extend the site-based study to pick up traffic signal junctions as well would probably take it a little too far. But I think the general question of stopping sight distances and the theoretical basis for them and comparison between different practices, I think, could be therefore applied quite usefully to traffic signals.
Yeah, and just the scope, Phil, there's some questions around sort of junctions in rural areas. It's just worth clarifying the sort of scope there of what areas are we looking at here?
So I think the particular focus is going to be at what I called in the presentation the edge sites, or the ones that are around that 60 kph area where suddenly, according to the current guidance, visibility does leap, and those tend to be at the edges of built-up areas, and that's often the case where new development is happening. But I think we should look at a range of sites. I think within this study, it's going to be difficult to look at rural sites. Someone did mention on one of the questions about research that's been carried out by Highways England to inform visibility splays in rural situations. I'm not personally familiar with that, but that does sound very interesting and relevant. I think we would need to bring that in and see how far Many for Streets needs to talk about non-trunk rural situations. Do we simply apply DMRB in those situations? Is that still appropriate? In which case, then that still begs the question: is what happens in this area when we move from a more urban world to a rural world around those more difficult cases?
Okay. There's quite a detailed question from Ahab about the original TMS study that's just come in, Phil. You're casting your eye down that and maybe thinking about a response to that one. And then there's sort of a couple of questions, or quite a few questions, about sort of the change in modern day vehicle stopping ability and to be considered. Any views on how the consultant might take that into account?
Well, just to answer the question on the TMS study, no, it didn't look at all casualty or collisions. It identified, so this is part of the road safety investigation aspect of the study. TMS looked very carefully at the circumstances around those collisions and decided which ones, in their view, could have been related to poor visibility. So, as he says in the question, a rear shunt collision may or may not be appropriate. I need to check the detail of exactly which types of collisions they considered. But yes, they did only consider ones in which SSD was a probable cause. So the details of that again could be looked at, and it can be critiqued. Doesn't mean that the methodology that was used by TMS has to be replicated, but it was the previous piece of work, and I think we regard this as building on from that. In terms of car performance, that was something that did underpin the original decision in Manual for Streets 1 and the research that was done by TRL to look at braking rates. So I think the value was in the presentation, but I went through it very quickly. That underpins DMRB and DB32 was 0.26G, 0.25G, I think, or 0.26G, that's a very gentle rate of braking, actually. And I've not seen the evidence for that. But somebody said that it is possible to stop in even a road with snow covering at that kind of rate of deceleration. Emergency braking, modern cars, I understand, can do getting on for 1G. The view was taken based on practice elsewhere in 2007 to look at 0.45G. I think that's something that could be done. So whether braking performance has improved considerably since 2007, I can't say. But the original Manual for Streets did think about modern cars with anti-lock brakes and so on.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Just looking, there was an early question that perhaps we missed, and it might be worth sort of just exploring this. And it was picked up in slightly different ways about sort of I guess the conflict that arises around visibility calculations. So one from Julian: is it fair to comment that relaxation in X distance requirements could have benefits in terms of opening up development, rather than the easing of Y distances, which are subject to more variables? My point being that the number of drivers that sit 4.5 meters back the giveaway line is very small, and therefore could 2.4 meters be adopted as a standard X distance? I guess this sort of, do you want to say a bit about this issue about what we're trying to do here in terms of this potential conflict between development or safety? Is there a conflict there in my simple sense?
I think there's certainly a perception of a conflict, and very often there are points of disagreement between professionals who have perhaps those different interests in mind primarily. I think what we're trying to do with this research is get the right answer, because if we're asking for too much visibility, and that is undermining the ability to deliver development, particularly in constrained sites, because very often in a more rural site or a more greenfield site, it may not be difficult at all to achieve very large visibility splays, but are those the kind of sites that are the most sustainable ones? It may be that the more constrained sites that are in or on the edges of urban areas should be developed first, because they're easy to serve by public transport and active travel. But those sites might be difficult to develop if we have visibility display requirements that are excessive. But of course, as I said in the presentation, if we get it wrong the other way around, then we're creating a hazard and we're undermining the statutory duty of highway authorities to reduce collisions and casualties. So I think we just all need to be better informed as to what the right answer is in different situations, and some more targeted research on that I think would be very helpful. Just on the point of the setback distance, I mean, Manual for Streets 1 does actually say that 2.4 should be the standard X distance. It says that normally there isn't a safety case for going to 4.5. Again, this is something that I think has been kind of lost or sometimes overlooked, and there has still been a tendency to believe that 4.5 setback is better, and DMRB currently says, I think you can only go to 2.4 if the road is not a through route. What the basis for that is, I don't know. I'm very interested to see if there is some research that underpins that requirement in DMRB. So I think we do have to look at X distances. And we need to think about how we can do that in the research methodology.
Okay, there's still some questions coming in. What I suggest we might do now, though, is we've focused sort of on sort of the technical side. We've not had very many questions about in terms of the process of consultants, etc., getting involved. I'm going to just go up and share another poll now. So for the audience, if you wouldn't mind, this is about how you might like to get involved in this work moving forward. And again, this isn't completely scientific, it's just to get a flavour and a feel. It doesn't commit you to anything. So we've put just 3 options up there. So if you just want to start voting, it just gives us a feel for who might want to be involved in which way, and then we can come back to the questions. Just about 2/3 of you have voted now. We'll just take it a bit more if you want to press some buttons. Okay, so we're up to about 80% now, so I'll close that and share. So we've got 16% of you think you'd like to be involved in some form of the consultancy work, 21% as part of a members advisory